Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Last week, I think I ended the webinar with a, not prediction, but at least sort of two options where we can see where the country is headed, and more importantly, or just as importantly, who is in control. And I said that a lot will depend on whether the reasonableness law, the law that will strike the ability of the Supreme Court in Israel to use reasonability to strike down a law, a government decision, or even a government appointment or not. We saw that it had already gone through its first reading, and as we know, it needs to go through a second and third reading, which are usually instantaneous, one after the other. And we knew this week it was going to be on the docket, and that proved true. And I said that basically it's going to be if it's going to be passed without any changes, then there is a suspicion that Netanyahu is no longer completely in charge, or at least not as much as he was previously. And if it was changed or even didn't make it through, was sort of pushed off again, that means that Netanyahu is very much in charge. Well, what we did see is that the law was passed as was written in the first reading with no changes. We saw on Monday a long and raucous debate in the Knesset on the plenum about the law. What was most interesting about the debate, especially for, let's say, Bibi watchers, Netanyahu watchers, is he was very much sort of surrounded. Maybe it was a strategy, maybe it was just the way it was, but he was surrounded on one side by Justice Minister Yariv Levin, very much one of the architects of judicial reform. And on the other side, you had Itamar Ben-Gvir of the far right, Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power Party. And it seemed that they were making sure that few other people got to Netanyahu, were able to convince him to compromise, to take some more time. There were at least two occasions where Netanyahu answered a call and left the room, and either Levin or Ben-Gvir went after him to make sure that he didn't wilter, and he basically stuck to his guns. And it could well be that there were negotiations. There certainly was calls for negotiations to try and soften the bill. In the end, it came to naught, and the bill was passed as is. Netanyahu did not take part in the great celebrations by the government after. There were all these selfies and congratulations and slaps on the back. And in the end, the law passed pretty much, well, not pretty much, according to coalition opposition lines. It basically passed 64-0 because the opposition had decided that it was going to give a Pyrrhic victory to the coalition, and it left the plenum before the vote. So not a single person voted against it. So it was 64-0. In the words of some of the opposition, it was the sort of vote which North Korea or Syria would be proud of. That's the reason why they decided not to vote, because they didn't want to give it the legitimacy they believe, in the words of the opposition, it did not deserve. When it passed, there was again differences exactly what's going to come next. There were the hardliners like Ben-Gvir, who had very much called the reasonableness law the first course, the salad, as he called it, the sort of hors d'oeuvre, as it were, making it clear that he was happy that this passed, but he's expecting a lot more. There were others on the more moderate side of the coalition who were saying, let's take a breather now, let's go back to the negotiating table, let's see if we can find compromise, something that works for both the opposition and coalition. And that's really where Netanyahu fell out. He recorded a video later that evening, basically calling on the opposition to come to talks, saying that he's prepared to give it until November, which is quite a lot of time, but it isn't, because we have the summer vacation and then we have the Jewish holidays, and the Knesset doesn't even return until October. But there's still a fair amount of time, and I'm sure if there was seen to be a great will on both sides, I don't think there needs to be a hard and fast date for that. But Netanyahu certainly fell in the conciliatory camp and said that while this has passed, everything else is up for debate, up for negotiation, up for compromise, up for talks. So we'll wait to see what happens. Obviously, the opposition didn't take too kindly to that and said, you've already passed something which we told you not to pass. You put the gun on the table, and it's very hard to negotiate when the gun is on the table. So the opposition at this point were largely dismissive of Netanyahu's gambit. So it remains to be seen if they're coming to the table, and we'll find out more about that in the coming days and weeks. So the question is, what exactly is going to happen to this government? I did speak to a very senior opposition leader who basically predicted that this government will fall in November because Bibi just simply will not be able to give what the more extremist members of his government require, and that is laws like the Reasonableness law, but also on the Judicial Appointments Committee, on the override, even though Netanyahu has gone back and forth whether the override, the ability of the Supreme Court to override laws, whether that is on the table. It's not. He went on American TV programs and said override clause law has been completely taken off the table. But in Hebrew, he left a little bit more room for doubt. That is probably the most contentious part of it, but also the judicial appointments shake-up, committee shake-up will also be pretty contentious. And on that issue, there's no real reason why it's not being held at the moment. Justice Minister Levin has been called upon to form the committee, and he basically doesn't want to. He wants to, first of all, change the makeup of it, and only then call its membership. So until that time, there are no new judicial appointments. The fallout from the passage of that law on Monday was immediate. We saw massive demonstrations, people taking to the streets, Tel Aviv thoroughfares being closed down, also in Jerusalem. There was a lot of anger from opponents of the judicial reform, tens of thousands of people taking to the streets. As I said, there were strikes by doctors, there were strikes called all over the place, and some others threatened. There were Israel Air Force officers who said, or just regular pilots, who basically said that they're done, as far as they're concerned, with military service. They refuse to go anymore, whether it's mandatory service or voluntary, their annual voluntary service. And that, by the way, is probably the thing which worried the government most. Interestingly enough, IDF Chief of Staff was trying to get a meeting with Netanyahu to transfer the message before the vote, to really transfer the message that it really is having an effect on Israel's security ability. The fact that there are so many senior officers in the Air Force and other parts of the IDF who have threatened and already started not to show up for their service. And one can imagine, with all the threats that Israel faces, to have a certain segment of the army, especially at higher levels, higher echelons, and especially in the Air Force. Don't forget, the Air Force is really, when you look at the threat from Iran, it's really the advanced, it's the most advanced part of the army. It's the part of the Israel Defense Forces which could, if necessary, carry out an attack further afield. So one can imagine that the Chief of Staff was extremely worried. He certainly did relay his concerns to the Defense Minister, Gallant, if we remember Gallant, who has raised those fears in the past and even threatened to resign, and even Netanyahu fired him and then let him back in. Interestingly enough, while many opponents of reform saw Gallant as a possible ally, someone who could threaten to resign again, or even resign, or stand up and call out the reform, he voted with the rest of the Knesset for government reform, saying, I think it's better that I'm still in this position because I can still at least have some sort of sway. It remains to be seen exactly how much he can have. But the condemnation from abroad was also fast and furious, being led by the White House, followed by the UK, the European Union, and many others. And basically the message is that what keeps us as partners, as friends, as allies, is this democratic foundation. And if that's harmed, that's a problem for us. And really calling for a consensus on judicial reform going forward. The messages were pretty tight-knit. There was obviously a message that was in some way coordinated internationally, but it also had, that there was the first stage in the legal reform also had a direct and immediate effect on Israel's economy. We saw the shekel weakening almost immediately. Interestingly enough, earlier in the day when there was talk of compromise over the law, the shekel strengthened against other major international currencies. And as soon as it was realized that the law would pass as is, it weakened. Some of the international financial ratings agencies, Moody's and others, basically relegated Israel's credit rating for the first time in many, many, many years. This was obviously taken so seriously that the Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, had to put out a statement trying to say that this is just a momentary problem, but, they'll get back on track and try to lay out some of this government's economic accomplishments. But it was obviously something that really, really concerned them. Taking a step back before even the vote on Monday, another major event that happened this week was more related to Netanyahu, not the politician, but the person. We saw last week in the heat wave that is in Israel, as it is in parts of Europe and elsewhere, that Netanyahu fainted. He claimed that it was just a bit of exhaustion, a heat stroke, lack of fluids, but it's clear now that it was a lot more. Because now we understand that he had to undergo surgery to fit a pacemaker. Apparently his heart, he had some heart irregularities. And there was a lot of people quipping that the person who filled in for Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was under the knife, when he was in hospital, was Justice Minister Yariv Levin. And this week showed that Yariv Levin is really the sitting Prime Minister, whereas Netanyahu no longer is. I wouldn't go that far. Netanyahu still holds an element of control, but it's clear that this week was not what he wanted to happen. As I've stated many times before, Netanyahu wants stability. He doesn't want a lot of things that are happening on the economic front, on the threat to Israel's security, the destabilization, et cetera, et cetera. So Yariv Levin definitely this week sat in the Prime Minister's chair, even if it was temporarily. But really, at the end of the week, it's clear that Yariv Levin probably had more sway than he had months ago and certainly years ago. What is most interesting is what exactly is going to happen to this reasonableness law going forward, because it is under possible judicial review. There were at least 5 or 6 members, I think 7 members of the Supreme Court bench in Germany for a meeting, a conference, and they rushed back the day after the vote to discuss exactly what's going to happen, because immediately after the vote, the Supreme Court was petitioned by opposition parties and some NGOs to try and get them to strike down this law. Now, why is that not so simple? Because while the Supreme Court has struck down many laws in the past, and that's one of the bones of contention that the current government says that they want to take away that ability, they have not struck down a basic law. And this reasonableness law today was attached to basic law, the judiciary. So really, if they did strike it down, and it remains to be seen whether they will, will be a very interesting turn of events, because part of what the judicial revolution of Aaron Barak was in the 1990s was to create almost a quasi constitution and give basic laws more power than regular laws, and a lot more power than they were when he first came into the Supreme Court. And so really, if the Supreme Court today would strike down the reasonableness clause as part of a basic law, that would be largely unprecedented. But we've already seen this week something else which gives pause to those who think it cannot happen. The Attorney General did recommend the overturning of another basic law that was passed, I believe, in February or much earlier in the year, which would give her, or the Attorney General, whoever that may be, the ability to recluse a prime minister if a situation necessitated it. There was a law which was passed preventing, in theory at least, that would prevent the Attorney General from doing so. And she recommended to the Supreme Court, which is a real turn of events, to strike this law. And again, it is a basic law. So it becomes very, very interesting to see what happens when the Supreme Court sits, listens to the petitions. Apparently, it's going to rule in September. At the moment, despite the request to immediately freeze the process, the Supreme Court did not do so, which means that in theory, at least, the government's now in, the Knesset is now in recess. So practically it can't happen. But actually the government can still make decisions. But at this point in time, the Supreme Court cannot use the reasonability test because of this law until it rules on it. And that will be a real test, because one can imagine if it decides to strike down that law on the basis of it being unreasonable, which would be ironic and really puts us in a major constitutional crisis, because you have the government, the Knesset, which basically created a law to limit the powers of the Supreme Court saying, no, it will not limit itself, and it strikes down the law. That could be a real constitutional crisis, but we will not know what happens there until at least September. So I'm happy to open the floor for any questions on these issues or any other that are of interest this week.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So the first question is from Jay asking, real quick, can you just explain clearly the reasonableness law that was passed?
It's real quick is a difficult one, but basically the whole concept of reasonability in law actually goes back to 1948 British precedent, which means that, and in that case, it was only for extreme cases where if a government decision was made that would be considered extremely unreasonable, and it was really, as I said, in extreme cases, then the Supreme Court in England, the High Court or whatever it is, would be able to strike it down, even though it did not conflict with any specific law. What the reasonableness clause does is give the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down a law, even though it doesn't, or a government decision, even though it doesn't stand in opposition directly to any other law. It gives a much wider berth and ability of the Supreme Court to strike down laws, basically, that it deems as unreasonable without saying specifically it contravenes this law. The proponents of this law would say, well, that basically allows the opinions, the worldview, the ideology of the Supreme Court to come in and say, we're striking down this law, but not because it's against the law, not because it's unconstitutional or anything like that, but just because we believe, without perhaps having all the facts that a minister may have, that it is unreasonable. So that's what the proponents say is why it was necessary. What we have to remember as well is the reasonability clause is really the thin edge of everything. But what I mean by that is it's probably the one that there's most consensus, even though it doesn't seem that way. It's the first issue when negotiations take place between the coalition and opposition. It's the first one that was sorted out. Even Aaron Barak, the architect of the judicial revolution that gave the Supreme Court the power that it has today, which the present government want to clip, says if it was just about the reasonableness clause and they didn't do anything else, I could live with that. So it really shows that it's really the thin edge. You know, it's the let's say the one that probably even opponents really, when you dig down to it, are probably most comfortable with. I wouldn't say comfortable with, but most comfortable. So it created a lot of shockwaves because it's the first law that was actually passed, but it's certainly and intentionally the lightest, let's say, of the judicial reforms.
Thank you so much. Daniel Pipes asks, is there any reason why today's opposition, if it comes to power, cannot just vote to return to the reasonableness option to the Supreme Court?
Yes, they can. A basic law needs really a simple majority. That's another thing that was being debated early on with the whole judicial reform process, where the basic law, because it has a quasi-constitutional status, if we look at the US, to change a regular law is, I would say, simple, but relatively simple. But to change something in the Constitution is extremely hard. At the moment, there really is no difference. And there was a debate, should it be 61, a regular majority, should it be 70, which means, especially in this government, you need to bring in some of the opposition, or even 80, which means you've almost got a cross-consensus support for a particular law. But at this point in time, yes, the opposition, if we have elections tomorrow or whatever it would be, and they come into power, yes, they can strike that part of the basic law off and return the situation to what it was previously. But again, if you're factoring all the other judicial reform elements, then certainly it will be more difficult in the future. But again, we don't know what those details are at this present moment in time.
Thank you. A second question was, and many others have asked this, can the Supreme Court use another justification to substitute for reasonableness?
Let's just say I'm not a legal expert, so I'm going to tread carefully. To the best of my knowledge, it's going to clip their wings significantly. They can still rely on laws. For example, if they deem the government takes a step which they believe is discriminatory, which many people are worried about, there is a basic law against discrimination which they can use to uphold it. It means that, yes, they will have to actually find a law, a precedent to basically stand against whatever the government decision or the Knesset law is to strike it down. But it will certainly clips the power of the Supreme Court, but it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. It doesn't mean now that Supreme Court can't rule against laws. And again, it could even find a way. We'll have to, as I said, we'll have to wait till September. It could even find a legal way without using reasonableness, reasonability to strike down this clause in September. So we'll have to wait to see what the justices come up with. Maybe they won't strike it down. Maybe they'll accept it with reservations, but it will pass the judicial test. Again, we'll have to wait and see what happens in September.
Thank you. Robert Mednick, as well as Eric, ask, is there any chance, you did say that theoretically the Supreme Court could overturn this. Is there any chance that they will?
Well, it's not just theoretical. They actually could strike it down. As I said, it would be unprecedented, to the best of my knowledge, for the Supreme Court to strike down part of a basic law, but they certainly have the ability to do so. And as I said, this week, we've already got a taste of the fact that the judicial system with the Attorney General says that there is standing to strike down a basic law with this law about the disbarring the Attorney General from attempting to recluse the Prime Minister in certain situations. So we've already got the first sort of shot in this war, and we've understood that maybe they're preparing the way. Maybe this is just a coincidence that this was done in the same week as the reasonableness law, but the fact remains that it is a very unprecedented ruling by the Attorney, or let's say recommendation by the Attorney General. So we'll have to wait and see. But yes, they absolutely could strike it down.
Thank you. Jack Wasserman asked, what has been offered by the opposition by way of compromise negotiations?
Well, we should say that there's two levels of opposition at the moment. There's the opposition parties. There's the main parties. Benny Gantz is National Unity Party, there's Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, there's Victor Lieberman's party, Merav Michaeli's party. They all think differently. It's being led largely by Gantz and Lapid, who have their history and don't necessarily see eye to eye, but there's arguably a more important opposition, and that's the one by the protesters, the demonstrators, the ones who took to the streets, the ones who are leading the refusal to serve movements, et cetera, et cetera. They're the ones which have led the opposition, whereas the opposition of the Knesset is pretty toothless at this point because they have their own a minority. It's not this government doesn't have a majority of one like the previous government, which means that a lot of work has to do, and it's always teetering on the brink. 64 is in Israeli politics, at least, a 4-seat lead is relatively healthy, especially by recent year standards. But really, the one that's, I would say, even led to a backtrack by Netanyahu throughout this process is probably the opposition outside of the Knesset, which is taking largely a maximalist stand. They haven't been prepared, at least the leaders of the movement haven't been prepared to compromise. They believe that the whole idea of judicial reform is unnecessary, undemocratic, whereas the leaders of the opposition in the Knesset have sat down at the president's invitation at the president's residence and have sat across the table from the Likud and have discussed, as I said, the first issue which was resolved, which they found common ground on, was the reasonableness clause. But there wasn't too much agreement beyond that. Most of the country, according to polls at least, would like those negotiations to occur again in the coming days, in the coming weeks. So we'll see exactly what happens. Don't forget, there's a lot of electoral interest here. Benny Gantz, who was behind Yair Lapid in terms of seats at the last elections, is now polling far, far better. Largely, it could be argued because he's taken the sort of responsible adult position, sort of somewhere between the two extremes. But this week he made a bit of a misstep and he went down in the polls a little bit. Yair Lapid went up. So they will be taking all of these things into consideration because at some point, at least, there will be elections. I don't think personally it will be that quickly. But hopefully the two sides will get back to talking at the president's office. And we've got, as Netanyahu offered, at least a number of months to come to the table and try and figure out a way that some sort of consensus can be made around this issue.
Reuven Hawk asked, is there any alternative to Netanyahu within the coalition currently, if they were to go to elections? Do you think that Netanyahu's health issues as of late is preventing him from standing strong against some of the more extreme positions?
No, because this predated the recent health challenges that Netanyahu had. As I said, we've been seeing for a number of months that Netanyahu, this is a really unique coalition for Netanyahu. Netanyahu doesn't want this coalition. He wants Gantz in yesterday, at least. He has always had a party to the left of him. At the moment, he probably represents the most left-wing, if we can call it that, the most left-wing element in a right-wing stroke extreme right-wing coalition. And that's not a place that Netanyahu likes to be, especially when he's looking for international support. The invitation by President Biden, while it was given a couple of weeks ago, no firm date has been provided. So that still is a little bit up in the air. But a lot of his conversations abroad, whether with international leaders, whether with Jewish organizational leaders, are very much formulated around this message that this is a dangerous process for Israel and Israel's international standing. So this is not something he wants. He wants stability. He wants to be able to rule without rocking the boat too much. But as I said, he's the most left-wing. He represents at least part of the most left-wing element of this coalition. But the far more right-wing members, whether it is the Religious Zionist Party, whether it is Jewish power party, but also importantly, the ultra-Orthodox parties, which this week even try to take advantage of this sort of vacuum and try and throw in a law which would legalize the situation, or at least the first step to legalizing the situation, where the ultra-Orthodox do not need to serve in the army, which is an extremely contentious point, and one that many suspect is really part of the drive of this government to pass this judicial reform, to make sure that laws ensuring ultra-Orthodox don't need to serve will not be struck down by the Supreme Court as they have been in the past. So all these elements which really do want and do need a large part of the judicial reform, whereas Netanyahu, I would argue, would prefer it either goes away or would prefer there's some sort of compromise and consensus. So he's in a very, very difficult situation. His health concerns, he's tried to brush them off. It's impossible for anyone outside of his medical team to really know how far they go. There is a law which says the Prime Minister is supposed to provide detailed medical records every single year, and he has not done so since, I think, 2016 or 2017. So it's impossible for the public to know. He is now fitted with a pacemaker. We understand that he had irregular heart activity, so it's clear that not everything is right there, but he's putting on a good show, a brave face, facing the nation a couple of times this week. So he's trying to promote that image that he's very much in charge, even though, as I said, events this week would dictate to a certain extent that may not be as true as it was previously.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, one more question. We have the most questions we've had in quite a long time.
It's a busy week. It's a contentious time.
Absolutely. Sam Clay asks, how could the neighboring countries progress towards peace agreements with Israel when it's seen as radically divided?
I don't think that necessarily. I mean, Israel's always been divided, like any democracy. The numbers for many years. I can't remember the last time that Israel had a government which represented more than 70 seats. So Israel's always been divided. There's always been a strong center, center right, center left. The historic center left party, Labour Party, according to all polls, won't even reach the electoral threshold. But they're definitely represented well in, center left parties, Benny Gantz's party, Yair Lapid's party. So we were divided last year. We were divided when the Abraham Accords. We weren't divided on the Abraham Accords because pretty much all Israelis welcome them, or most Israelis welcome them. But the country was divided. What makes this different is that this really does speak to, according to opponents of judicial reform, the central democratic face and character of Israel. And that's why we've seen demonstrations, the likes of which arguably we haven't seen maybe since the beginning of the state, or at least for many, many years and many, many decades. And really, people are talking about two Israels in a way that perhaps they haven't, maybe at least since the beginning of the Oslo process, or maybe the disengagement. But there is a real split in society. There are divisions. The majority want compromise. The majority want the main elements of the opposition, the coalition, to sit down and work something out. But yes, the country is divided. There are no peace plans on the table. As I've said in recent weeks, potential peace or normalization with Saudi Arabia, it's not really in Israel's hands. There are no really outstanding issues between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's really between Saudi Arabia and the Biden administration at this point. But I don't think Saudi Arabia will really mind too much. Obviously, they it wouldn't look so great at this point, but I don't think they really care so much about Israel's democratic institutions or the rule of law or judicial issues. So talks remain strong below the surface there, but definitely it's less about the neighboring nations. It's more how Israel's perceived further afield with some of its allies in Europe and North America. Certainly, there is some reputational damage there. The international media is very much playing into this narrative that it is changing the shape of Israel's democratic character. And that's what's leading the narrative, which then is being fed back towards Netanyahu from international leaders. So I think that's probably where the greatest damage is being done at this point. But again, everything will depend on the coming months, whether there will be serious talks, whether the opposition coalition will come and talk this out, come to some sort of consensus, come to some sort of agreement by November. That's the date that Netanyahu has given. So we'll have to see what happens.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for webinar, Enough Talk, How Do We Counter Islamism across America with Benjamin Baird. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.